I hate playing the Patriots. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, or if you are new here, then please do me a favour and hit that subscribe button. So, the Cleveland Browns, once again beaten pretty convincingly by the New England Patriots. This is now 6 losses in a row, I believe, against New England. I am still yet to see the Cleveland Browns win a game in New England, not just in Foxborough, but in New England in general, just a away game, against New England. I think 1992 is the last time that they did it, 5 years before I was born. I must wait once again to see that moment, because the Browns, as they always seem to do in these last meetings and kind of pretty much since then, is always get blown out by the Patriots. You look at these 6 consecutive losses against the Patriots. I think one of the games was within like a touchdown. Pretty much all of them are blowouts. They pretty much bring belt to our arse most time that we play against them, and today was no different. A game where Myles Garrett broke the Cleveland Browns record for sacks in a game with 5, and they still lost by 19 points. He even broke the record. That's the most sacks that New England Patriots have ever given up to a player. And they've played some pretty good pass rushers, in their history as a franchise, and they still won by 19 points. So it just shows you how putrid of a performance this was from the Cleveland Browns. There's not too much to talk about because, as per usual, it's the same kind of bad stuff. But I suppose we'll talk about it as much as we can. A game that looked pretty promising, shall we say, to start. Yes, scripted Kevin is kind of become a thing. Kevin Stefanski on those scripted drives, he is good at that. How good is he outside of those scripted drives? That is obviously a much bigger debate to be had, and obviously not done any favours to himself today with that, because after that first scripted drive, which, don't get me wrong, credit where credit's due, Kevin Stefanski was in his bag on that drive. Couple of nice plays. Malachi Corley getting, back-to-back big plays in consecutive weeks. 31-yard rush on that end around. The nice touchdown. Harold Fanning coming out of the fullback on the corner route. In the heavy formation. So that was a nice touchdown. But other than that, it then just went downhill, and I think a lot of us expected that to happen, and that is exactly what happened. And as I said, outside of the first scripted drive, this was pretty bad from the offense. Just continued to struggle offensively, as we've seen from this team all season long. Last week was, more of just a flash in the pan, shall we say. We spoke about it then. Is this something we should expect? Them scoring 30 points, maybe obviously not scoring that amount of points, but maybe the offense getting back on track, and you can certainly say that was not the case after this week, with the offense being as poor as they have been pretty much most of the season outside of that Miami game last week. So going into the bye week at 2-6, obviously not great. I said in the preview, if we had gone into this bye week at 3-5, depending on what happens with the Steelers, depending on what happens with the Bengals, etc., in their games, you might only be a game and a half out of first place in the AFC North, which sounded pretty crazy to say, but that could have been the case. Now you're sitting there at 2-6. Things are a lot more unlikely now, and you're 3-5 after the bye. Maybe we've seen, you can make an argument, you can try and clutch at straws there and say there's a path to, playoffs, maybe, or division, that's probably a bit out of reach, but maybe playoffs, sneaking as a wild card. But at 2-6 going into the bye, with obviously the records that, the rest of the teams in the AFC have, you're pretty much at that point looking at a 1% chance of making the playoffs, 2% chance. So at what point do you start railing it in is obviously going to be questions, and at what point do you make changes at quarterback? Is there going to be changes at coaches, etc.? All of that stuff is obviously going to be asked over the coming weeks. But back to this game, as I said, started quite well, then went obviously terribly wrong. There was, the defense did pretty well. They gave up some yards early on in this game, but they got stops at the end of drives where they needed to, held the Patriots to field goals. And there was one moment in this game where it was 7-3. Carson Schwarzenegger gets an interception. just furthering his defensive rookie of the year performances this year, setting the Browns offense up nicely. And at that point, I think that was the turning point of this game. If the Browns go and score there, get a touchdown in particular, and make that game 14-3, then I think we're having a much different conversation right now than obviously what did ended up happening, and that was obviously stalling out on offense, settling for a field goal and missing the field goal, and not being able to take advantage of that opportunity and coming out with only 0 points from that. And obviously then they were then able to go and get 3 points, take the lead into the half, and they pretty much just went full steam ahead from there. So that was the big turning point in this game for me. That was the big momentum shifter. As I said, if the Browns score there, get a touchdown there, 14-3, I think we're having a much different conversation. And instead, they ended up not getting any points, let the Patriots go get the lead, and then they just were able to kick on from that and go and basically easily, comfortably win win the game from there on out. So really disappointing. Myles Garrett, as I mentioned earlier, career day, record-breaking day, 5 sacks. Went into this game with 5 sacks. He now has 10 sacks on the season because of these 5 sacks, and his team lost by 19 points. There's a clip of him obviously throwing his helmet on the floor on the side, looking very angry, and rightfully so. You have 5 sacks in a game as a player, and your team gets blown out like this. What else can you do? It's obviously going to be very, very frustrating. I know a lot of people are going to do the whole trade Myles stuff. I don't understand the whole trade the player that just had one of the greatest performances by a Cleveland Browns defensive player in Cleveland Browns history. Regardless of the score, that was one of the greatest performances, the most sacks a player's ever had, and it's not his fault that the rest of the team around him is as bad as they are, and that doesn't even consider the fact that you can't really trade that contract anyway. But you can understand why he's disappointed. On the flip side of it, he signed that contract, so he can't really, I say he can't moan. You can of course moan when you have 5 sacks in a game and your team lets you down and you lose by 19 points. But part of that frustration is him knowing that he did sign that contract and he is now here, and he can't, he doesn't have that same leverage per se, shall we say, as he did in the off season. So really disappointing to waste a game like that from Myles Garrett. If Myles Garrett has 5 sacks in a game that you win, we're talking about that game for years down the line. And instead he had 5 sacks in a game that, as I said, we got blown out. So we're not going to be talking about that for years down the line. So really disappointing stuff there. The offense, obviously starting with Dylan, really not great today. I've defended Dylan, not to the extent of me saying that I've seen enough from him and he deserves to be the future starter, etc., etc. But I didn't think that he'd done anything in the previous 3 games to justify calling for him to be benched. Coming into this game, he had 0 turnovers. Went up against 2 really tough defenses in obviously the Vikings and Pittsburgh, and then even the Miami game playing in pretty terrible weather conditions. So, there were plenty of excuses that you could have used for Dylan. And that's just before we even get into the excuses of how bad the offensive line is and how bad the wide receivers are around him, etc. But in this game, really disappointing from Dylan. Missed a few throws, missed a throw to Isaiah Bond, which, don't get me wrong, Isaiah Bond for some reason running to the sideline when he should have been running into the end zone. That's not to justify the bad throw, it's still a bad throw, but that was just a bad play from both of those guys there. Both of them just showing why, the disappointment that I have in both of those guys. Isaiah Bond, people like Gage Laverdane, people like Jamari Thrash, people that had good camps, and Isaiah Bond comes in and just automatically gets their snaps and gets kind of the spot ahead of them, and he is not given any reason to show that that was justified or that was earned. So he continues to be some pretty bad performances from Isaiah Bond, but back to Dylan, pretty bad performance from Dylan as well. As I said, you can't make an argument to bench a guy when he's playing clean football. He's not turning the ball over, and he's not the reason that you're losing games. But in this game, only 156 yards on 35 attempts. Yes, 2 touchdowns, but the 2 interceptions, 2 pretty bad interceptions. I mean, the second one, in all honesty, you probably rather him throw that interception there than the Browns just have to punt, because Corey's punting is so bad at the minute that it was probably better off a better situation and getting the field position than they would have with the punt anyway. But even still, a pretty bad throw from him there. And obviously the first one was absolutely terrible, the first interception. So, I've as I said, I've defended Dylan up to this point, but and I know that Kevin Stefanski has said that they are going to stick with him coming out of the bye. Do I think that's the right decision? Not necessarily. Do I think that's the wrong decision? Not necessarily. As I said, I've defended him up to this point, but after this performance, I don't think there is any reason to keep him in there. I would be perfectly happy with making the move to Shadur Sanders after the bye week if that is what they were going to do. But that is not what they're going to do. So, there's only so much you can really talk about it. There's no point sitting here and doing a whole video moaning about it. Would I like to see it? Probably, but it's obviously made the decision that's not going to happen. So one more bad performance out of Dylan, and I think they have no choice of doing that. But Dylan was bad, as I said. Offense overall was really bad. Going into this game against one of the best run defenses in the NFL, one of the biggest things I spoke about in the preview, had to get the run game going in this game for you to have any chance of moving the ball downfield. You had to make the threat of the run game there. They were unable to do that. Quinshon, only 9 carries for 19 yards. They continue to not give up 50 yards to any rusher this year. And other than Dylan Gabriel's 13 yards and Malachi Corley's 31 yards, you got 5 yards rushing from everyone not named Quinshon Judkins. So just a really bad rushing performance overall. Obviously, passing game, only 156 yards, nearly half of those to Harold Fanning. Another 37 to David Njoku. Said in the preview, that was the tight ends were their route to success in this game. That opening drive, getting Harold Fanning involved. If they were going to continue to keep moving the ball, that is what it was going to look like, and they were unable to do that. So obviously disappointing stuff there. And as I said, just the offense continuing to be putrid, continuing to be awful. At what point when you have an offensive head coach do you say enough is enough? We got a pretty good seal of approval, shall we say, from Jimmy. Was it yesterday or whenever that came out? Him talking about Kevin, it sounded like it sounded in those comments like Kevin is safe, and from what we heard from Jimmy. But as I said, at what point can you just keep justifying these awful offensive performances from an offensive head coach? Yes, as I keep on saying every single week, there are excuses for everyone involved in terms of, well, not everyone involved, but in terms of, Kevin Stefanski, Dylan Gabriel, etc. I mean, Kevin Stefanski is, you can argue Dylan Gabriel is his pick or whatever, but, Dylan Gabriel is Dylan Gabriel. He's not exactly got Drake May like the Patriots have. Offensive line is just, continues to be a mess. Obviously, wide receiver room, arguably one of the worst in the NFL. Poor weapons, poor resources on the offensive side of the ball. But again, you can keep making excuses. But as I said, at what point do you say enough is enough when the offense is as bad as it is every single week and you've got an offensive-minded head coach? The defense, as I said with Myles, of course, unbelievable performance from him. 5 sacks, incredible from him. Carson Schwessinger, until he got injured in this game, was really good. And, to mention the injury, that's just an absolute another punch in the stomach. You get blown out in the game, that's one thing. And then you lose your star rookie linebacker, which for what could be up to 4 to 6 weeks. If it is, it's reported that it could be a high ankle sprain. So, that could be anything up to 4-6 weeks if he is out for that, which would, of course, derail any defensive rookie of the year race, because that's one of the few awards that you don't need the kind of wins, the team wins to kind of win that award. If you're that good as a rookie on the defensive side of the ball, it doesn't matter what your record is. But that will obviously take a big hit on that kind of rookie of the year campaign if that is the case. So that's just really disappointing. Up until then, as I said, played really well. Alex Wright played really well in this game as well on the defensive side of the ball. But other than that, the defense, I've criticised them in other weeks, and I criticised them on Twitter a few times, and people will always point out and go straight back to the offense. And yes, the Browns' offense is the worst part of this team, and you of course have to recognise that, but that doesn't mean that we can't criticise the defense when the defense does play bad. Two things can be true: the offense can be absolutely terrible, and the defense can be overrated in areas that and not be as good as we expect them to be, because we all know how good this defense can be. We've seen it, in the last 3 years. Some of the performance that they've had, they've got like 6 of the top 40 defensive performances by NFL teams in the last 3 years. We've seen how good they can be, which makes it even more disappointing and more frustrating when they do have performances like they had today. Obviously, when a player has 5 sacks, you might think the defense didn't play well, didn't play that bad. But as I said, there are plenty of areas you can continue to criticize this defense. It's almost as if the defense has a compass that only points north. They're unable to go east to west. They're unable to, any time that teams run any kind of lateral run game on them, it works, and they seem to have success against the Browns. Anytime you run misdirection against the Browns, it seems to be an easy 10 yards, an easy first down every single time. So, there's the defense continues to show that they can't guard, misdirection. They can't guard east to west. They seem to only be able to go north to south or south to north, and that continue to get their aggressiveness used against them. Whenever offensive coordinators can get creative and can use that aggressiveness against them, they always seem to have success in doing so. And that continues to be really disappointing. And on top of the fact that another road game where the Browns defense gave up over 30 points going into this game. The Browns at home, the defense was giving up 11 points a game. On the road was giving up 33 points a game. A lot of that obviously wasn't helped out by the offensive performances in them games as well, but still 33 points a game, and then 32 points given up in this game, another away game. So they continue to not be able to prove the people wrong that are saying that this defense can't travel. That continues to be a theme for this defense. They are unable to translate their performances on the road, and that again happened this week, which is just of course really disappointing to see. So as I said, the offense is horrible. We all know that. We expect the offense at this point every single week to not even disappoint us, because as I said, we know how bad they are. We just expect them to be bad. We don't expect really anything from this offense. But when you've got a defense that, you've seen how good they can be, and you continue to see them, get gashed in areas that, they can be better at, it is annoying. It is frustrating. And as I said, when you continue to put up performances like this on the road, it is also disappointing as well. So, I'm not going to sit here and harp all day on the defense. They're not the reason the Browns lost this game per se. Of course, they gave up 32 points. Obviously, one of the interceptions from Dillon put them in pretty bad position, but other than that, they pretty much gave up all these points themselves. So, yes, you don't put this all on them, but two things can be true. The Browns' offense can be terrible, and the Browns' defense can be disappointing at the same time, and they continue to be disappointing in this game, obviously on the road. Jim Schwartz just, essentially got bent over in this game, and belt to ours, basically got, Josh McDaniel, all credit to him, exploited Jim Schwartz in this game. As I said, used their weaknesses against them, used their aggressiveness against them, and that's how they were able to have success. Drake May, spoke about it in the preview. He was one of my favourite quarterback prospects coming out in the last few years. There's a reason for that. He is just an incredible player. He is so fucking good, and it's just so annoying that teams like the Patriots that win 6 Super Bowls, that make the playoffs every year for 2 decades. They're bad for 3 years, and then they get a player like Drake May. They go from Tom Brady, oh no, we have to have Mac Jones for a couple of years, and then they get Drake fucking May. Meanwhile, the Browns haven't had a quarterback for fucking 40 years. It is really frustrating. The Browns get the 2nd overall pick last year, the year after Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels, and Drake May. And Drake May went 3rd in that draft. I'd have happily been sat there screaming for Drake May at number 2. So it is really annoying. Drake May is very good. You got to give the defense some credit in that per se, that they are going up against. He's playing better than any other quarterback in the NFL right now. The Browns were able to get that 1 interception on him. I think his 3rd interception of the year. They were able to get 6 sacks on him. Obviously, Myles getting 5. Myles, pretty much all them sacks going on Will Campbell, by the way. So all those people saying that Will Campbell was going to deal with Myles were, incredibly wrong, despite the loss. But just disappointing overall. And one more thing on the defense, Matt Collins. I mean, I swear the last 2 times we've played them, he's had more yards in those 2 games than he's had in every other games, in between that period. This guy always seems to go off against us, and another time today. I mean, the secondary was bad overall today. The safeties after last week, really disappointing performance from them. Rayshon Jenkins went out with an injury. Delpit looked pretty banged up in this game, so he wasn't at his best. Denzel Ward, I'll be honest, was getting kind of beaten up out there by these bigger receivers. He had a pretty bad day as well. So, not great from the defense. Obviously not great from the offense. Special teams continues to, as per usual, give up 35 to 40 yards on every single return while not being able to get 25, 30 yards themselves. Another missed kick. Corey continues to his punting struggles. So just bad overall, really. Another bad performance. Browns fall to 2-6. Where do we go from here? I suppose at least we don't have to watch the Browns play football next week. I suppose that is one only positive. And we get to watch the Buckeyes against Penn State. So I suppose there is that. But, all jokes aside, I never like to only do negatives in this video. So, the positives I suppose we can take from this game is we do continue to see good performances from Harold Fanning, from Carson Schlesinger, from some of these rookies. Really excited. Whatever quarterback the Browns take in the first round next year, Harold Fanning is going to be very good for them. And if JOK can come back from his injury, him and Carson Schlesinger are going to look very good next year. But I suppose that is one more good news thing for the tanking crowd out there that are, want to go all in on a quarterback and go all in on a quarterback high. And the best way of doing that, of course, even with having 2 first round picks, is having as high as a pick as you want. The New York Jets won today, actually beat the Bengals in a pretty wild ending to that game. So they get their first win of the season. Can't remember who they're playing next week, but if they get a win next week, I doubt they do. But, the Browns play the Jets coming out of their bye. So we could be looking at a situation in 2 weeks' time where the Browns lose to the Jets and they in a position of currently holding the first overall pick. So if it gets to that, then, I've said plenty of times, I'm not a tanking person. I don't go into any season wanting to tank. I don't think that's a smart thing to do. I think it builds a losing culture. But if you are 2-6, 2-8, 2-6, 2-7, 2-8, and you do hold that position of the first overall pick, there is a quarterback like Mendoza continues to play as well as he has. At that point, I'm not too against, not making decisions that aren't exactly conducive to winning, shall we say. But obviously, disappointed in this one. Really disappointing performance from pretty much all aspects of the team. Offense continues to be horrendous. Defense, was good in spots. Myles having 5 sacks, just incredible. Really are wasting Myles in Cleveland, but what else can we do? I'd still rather waste Myles and me be selfishly get to watch him every Sunday than him play for another team. But as I said, defense disappointing in areas. Special teams obviously just continues to be as bad as they are, and just an overall disappointing day. But who knows? Browns back in Mendoza contention, so we'll see how the next few weeks go. Obviously, as I said, we've got the bye week coming up, so lots of things to talk about, lots of things to assess this team, where they're at 2-6, assess the coaching situation, assess the quarterback situation, even despite Kevin saying that they're not going to make that move, and obviously, just assess the kind of Brown season overall as it is, but. I can't really think of anything else to say about that disappointing performance. Once again, blown out by the New England Patriots. Just tell me something new, I suppose. Tell me something new. But that would do it for me today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you do enjoy this content, then please drop this video a like. Hit the subscribe button. It's free, but it really, really helps out my channel. You can also check the links in the description to see where you can follow and interact with me on social media. As I always say, I'm trying to build a community of Cleveland Browns fans, and even if that means I only get to talk to one fan a day, I'm happy because I'm talking Browns football with the best fan base in the world. Thanks again for watching, guys. Have an amazing week. Enjoy the bye week. Enjoy this time off of not watching Browns football. not getting annoyed by Browns football. But most importantly, as dirty as it feels, go Browns.